As 2014 wound down, the Turner family spent their holidays like millions of other folks in the United States. They spent time with loved ones and celebrated the festivities. They even took the time to make the long drive from Colorado Springs down to Georgia and then up to Tennessee to visit with those who had profound impacts upon their lives. But on New Year's Day, while the rest of the world made resolutions and committed to being better, no, the best versions of themselves in 2015, Malcolm and Annelyntherese Turner devolved into the worst versions of themselves and tried their hands at murder. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It might be time to update Corinthians to remind wedding guests that love does not murder. In today's quasi-doubleheader, the only thing that could keep the Turners together would be the death of the third in their love triangle, the mother of Malcolm's son. I will refer to the Turners by just their first names, Malcolm and Annelyntherese, throughout the course of the episode in order to help keep them distinct. For today's episode, I relied on opinions from the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, as well as the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, and a number of articles on the Leaf Chronicle, Military Times, and Army Times. Malcolm Turner and his wife, Annelyntherese Turner, were an Army specialist in E4 and an Army sergeant in E5, respectively. The Turners were married and had a daughter together, and in late 2012, Malcolm Turner found himself in Korea, presumably at Camp Humphreys near Seoul. Camp Humphreys is the largest of the 73 Army bases in South Korea and hosts over 35,000 military and civilian personnel. Annelyntherese was not in Korea with Malcolm, and it appeared that in this instance, absence made the heart wander, and Malcolm began an intimate relationship with another soldier named Chelsea. Chelsea was approximately 19 years old in 2012 when they began their relationship, and Malcolm was around 24. Malcolm and Chelsea's relationship continued for a few months before Malcolm finally admitted to Chelsea that he had a family back in the United States and that he was married. I know that being 14 to 17 hours ahead of your loved ones feels so isolating, but in all 3 years we were in Japan, I didn't just forget that I had family and friends. When Malcolm finally confessed, Chelsea ended their relationship, and shortly thereafter discovered she was pregnant with Malcolm's child. Chelsea and Malcolm rotated out of Korea and weren't making efforts to stay in touch. Chelsea was assigned to Fort Campbell, which is on the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, and Malcolm was assigned to Fort Carson, near Colorado Springs. In Colorado, Malcolm and Annelyntherese reunited and continued merrily on their way. Malcolm did not disclose his infidelity now that he was back home with his wife and their daughter. In October 2013, Chelsea gave birth to Malcolm's son while assigned to Fort Campbell. She would have been about 20 years old at this point. Chelsea was a single mom living off base in Clarksville, Tennessee, and she found love. She married, and they were raising Malcolm's son together. I've only been to Clarksville, Tennessee one time. It was to drop off swag bags for a fundraiser event. However, having lived in Nashville for 2 years, I can fairly safely confirm that Clarksville is a bit of a sleepy town, and that most soldiers stationed at the post spend their free time in Nashville. My estimate is that soldiers comprise a solid 30 to 40% of honky-tonk patrons on any given weekend. In mid-2014, Chelsea filed a child support claim, which would require Malcolm to contribute financially to the raising of his child. Malcolm did the reasonable thing and agreed to pay $200 each month. Unfortunately, Malcolm still had problems honoring his commitments, and his promises lasted less than a month. He made exactly one payment of $100 and promptly stopped. He became evasive and tried dodging the paternity test that would scientifically and legally tie him to his obligations. Now, I can't find this written anywhere, but I assume he couldn't make $200 each month disappear without his wife noticing and asking questions. The way their courts-martial unfolded, I suspect Annelyntherese pulled the strings in their partnership. Malcolm was being shifty about contributing child support, so Chelsea and Malcolm continued to try and find a solution and communicated via social media. As we learned in our last episode with Caitlin Day, social media conversations aren't as private as people assume, and Annelyntherese discovered the messages, as well as Malcolm's adulterous relationship. Annelyntherese went into fact-finding mode. Hell hath no search engine like a woman scorned. Annelyntherese contacted Chelsea to get more information about what she was reading between Chelsea and Malcolm. Chelsea updated Annelyntherese. She had the conversations that Malcolm should have, and told Annelyntherese that it had been nearly 2 years since Chelsea ended their relationship, and Chelsea informed Annelyntherese that Malcolm was the biological father of her son. Annelyntherese, having confirmed the affair with Chelsea, turned her sights to Malcolm. Malcolm was out of town on leave and began receiving a series of text messages from his wife. These text messages get a little weird, and truly I struggled to make sense of the allegations that got thrown around because they are largely nonsensical. So please bear with me as we dive into this. Annelyntherese texted Malcolm that Chelsea had taken out a hit on him, that she'd hired a hitman to kill him. Annelyntherese also said that Chelsea had sent someone to rape Annelyntherese, and that this mystery assailant had nearly raped their daughter. Finally, Annelyntherese told Malcolm that a cartel was going to come kill him because he had not retaliated against Chelsea, but that Annelyntherese was going to be killed instead in a swap for his life. When I first read these messages, I thought Annelyntherese told Malcolm that the only way to stop Chelsea's alleged hit was to murder her. But the more I read, the more convoluted this manipulation scheme became. Chelsea just confessed to Malcolm's wife that she hired a hitman. Caitlin Day spent months trying to hire a hitman, and Chelsea just walked into a bad guy department store in rural Tennessee, ordered 1 rape and 1 murder pleas? An assailant showed up at the Turner's home and then just left? Annelyntherese didn't call the police when their daughter was nearly sexually assaulted. Did Annelyntherese negotiate directly with the supposed cartel hitman, or did she negotiate with Chelsea to swap Annelyntherese's life for Malcolm's? None of this adds up. Imagine Malcolm's surprise when he returned from leave and found his wife safe and alive. When Malcolm failed to immediately depart to Clarksville, Annelyntherese confronted him. She accused him of not wanting to kill Chelsea. She complained that Malcolm had fallen in love with Chelsea and asserted that love was the reason Malcolm didn't want to kill her, skipping the far more logical, maybe he doesn't want to be a murderer conclusion. In October 2014, instead of wishing his son a happy first birthday, Malcolm angrily confronted Chelsea about the warning Annelyntherese gave him, about the hitman/cartel/rapist that either already visited or was on their way. Chelsea denied making any threats to Malcolm or his family. She was asking for the child support she was legally entitled to, not trying to have Malcolm killed. Chelsea told him that if he really believed Annelyntherese and feared his family was in danger, he should take the issue to court. Malcolm seemed enraged by this suggestion that they allow the legal system to handle their legal problem, and told Chelsea that only sissies or people that are scared would go to court. Later in the month, Malcolm asked Chelsea for her address. He said he would need it in order to visit his son. Chelsea was hesitant to give Malcolm her address to let him know where she lived, but after discussing it with her spouse, they decided that was the right next step. In December 2014, Malcolm and Annelyntherese packed up their daughter and drove from Colorado to Georgia on leave for the holidays. I wonder what they talked about on their 20-hour drive, what podcasts or music they listened to in order to pass the time. I wonder if their daughter watched videos on a child-proofed tablet or whether they played the license plate game. I don't have any of that information, but I can piece together something they had on their minds as they celebrated Christmas and then rang in the New Year: Chelsea and child support. Months of stewing over her very reasonable request for $200 of support each month fueled their anger. Somewhere in their car was Malcolm's handgun, hollow point bullets he had recently purchased, and getaway clothing. On January 1st, 2015, Malcolm Turner, now 27 years old, showed up at Chelsea's apartment in Clarksville, Tennessee. He arrived unannounced around 12:30 and told Chelsea that he was there to meet their son. Chelsea was alone with their son at the apartment. Her spouse wasn't home, but she allowed Malcolm to come in. Maybe Chelsea, warmed by the glow of the recent holiday, was feeling generous and wanted to give Malcolm any opportunity to get to know the person he helped create. It had been a few months since the blow-up after Annelyntherese found out about Malcolm's affair, and maybe it seemed like things had finally settled. Upon entering, Malcolm immediately asked to use the bathroom, and once inside, texted Annelyntherese with the apartment number. When Annelyntherese received the text with Chelsea's apartment number, she left their daughter in their car and climbed the stairs to Chelsea's apartment. She must not have planned to stay long, leaving her young child in the car while she ran upstairs. It was only 23 degrees at the time. Together, Malcolm and Annelyntherese confronted Chelsea about her child support request, and as tempers flared, again confronted Chelsea about the hit. This time, specifically asking why she would take out a $20,000 hit on his life. Chelsea thought the father of her son was finally stepping up, only to have that man and his wife, a stranger to her, in her home, yelling nonsense about hitmen. This hitman conspiracy theory made no sense. All Chelsea wanted was $200 a month to help pay to raise their child. Why would she spend $20,000 of her own money to hurt Malcolm or his family? Would she even have that kind of money socked away? Killing Malcolm would only serve to ensure that Chelsea never got what she actually wanted, Malcolm paying child support. Chelsea, who had been holding their son during this confrontation, placed the baby on the couch and turned to respond to the allegations Malcolm and Annelyntherese slung. She clarified for them that they'd shown up to her house, unannounced and uninvited, accusing her of something she knew nothing about, and they were starting to piss her off. Annelyntherese and Malcolm whispered together for a few moments before Annelyntherese said more loudly to Malcolm, "Well, the choice is up to you. What are you going to do about it?" This moment was the culmination of weeks of discussion about his relationship with Chelsea, about 17 more years of child support, about what Malcolm could and must do to make it right. What was Malcolm going to do about it? This question sparked Malcolm to action, and he spun to face Chelsea. Malcolm screamed, "You think you're bad, huh? You think you're bad?" Malcolm drew his handgun and shot Chelsea 3 times from about 7 feet away. The first shot struck Chelsea in her arm, the impact spinning her around slightly. The second bullet hit her in the back, shattering a rib, and hit both her lung and the sac around her heart. The third and final shot hit Chelsea in the side of her head, knocking out some of her teeth. Chelsea had been standing near the couch when Malcolm fired at her. She was near their 1-year-old son, and this didn't seem to bother Malcolm and certainly didn't stop him. Both the second and third shots hit the couch after they struck Chelsea. Hollow point bullets are more destructive than conventional bullets. They're designed to expand upon impact. They are legal in the United States, but are banned by the 1899 Hague Convention for use during war because they cause additional unnecessary damage and are considered to be less humane than conventional bullets. After shooting Chelsea 3 times, Malcolm and Annelyntherese ran out the door, fleeing from the devastation they'd inflicted. Malcolm dropped his phone in the process of fleeing, which is kind of remarkable considering how much larger men's pockets are than women's. In spite of being shot 3 times and quickly losing blood, Chelsea fought through the pain and grabbed her phone, attempting to dial for help while following Malcolm and Annelyntherese out of her home. Perhaps because of issues with the nerves in her wounded arm or the sheer amount of blood coating her hands, Chelsea found that she was unable to dial, and, unsure what else to do, she threw her phone at Malcolm at the bottom of the stairs. I can only assume she was acting on pure adrenaline. Chelsea brought a whole new meaning to Army Strong. 2 downstairs neighbors were home and heard the 3 loud bangs and the screams from upstairs. They witnessed 2 people dressed in dark clothing running down the stairs and then away. They saw one carrying a large dark object they believed to be the gun. Next, Chelsea followed from the upper floor, shouting, "He shot me," and pointing at the fleeing figures of Malcolm and Annelyntherese. Then, Chelsea collapsed. One neighbor, who was able to ignore some serious self-preservation instinct, ran after the man he saw fleeing with a gun. The neighbor didn't catch Malcolm and Annelyntherese, but he did see them get into a sparkly light blue Chrysler 300 with Georgia plates, dark-tinted windows, and silver rims. In reading accounts of his recall, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that when I had to provide a description of a neon green motorized bike about 6 months ago, I told the police officer it was a motorcycle. He asked me if it was a dirt bike or a road bike, and I stared blankly at him and just repeated, "A motorcycle?" I discovered weeks later that it was a moped, not a motorcycle, but at least my description of the human on the moped was confirmed to be accurate. Now, this neighbor with an incredible memory then returned to the apartment, already dialing 911. He arrived, handed his wife his phone, and began administering first aid. Chelsea's doctors later testified that without that first aid, Chelsea likely would have died. Chelsea was somehow still conscious and lucid in those moments, and told the neighbor that her baby's father, Malcolm Turner, shot her. Emergency services arrived at the apartment within 3 minutes, and again, Chelsea identified Malcolm Turner by name as her shooter. Chelsea was driven by ambulance to Outlaw Field and flown by helicopter to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Not quite the R&R soldiers from Fort Campbell are accustomed to in downtown Nashville, to be certain. Outside Chelsea's apartment, police found Malcolm's phone, put out an APB for the Chrysler 300, and searched for the gun. They did not recover the weapon at the scene, and that's consistent with the neighbor's report that he saw Malcolm fleeing with the gun. While Chelsea fought for her life, Malcolm and Annelyntherese changed into fresh clothes, ditching their blood-soaked apparel. Using the baby wipes intended for their daughter, they scrubbed Chelsea's blood from their skin and tried to further erase the evidence of their crime. About an hour after the shooting, a patrol car stopped the Chrysler 300 and found 3 occupants: Malcolm, who was driving, Annelyntherese, and their daughter. Police found baby wipes with red-brown stains and similar stains on the car seat. Both Malcolm and Annelyntherese pled not guilty to their charges. Malcolm opted for a panel trial, a jury trial, and Annelyntherese, the quote-unquote so-called brains behind the plot, demanded a bench trial, a trial without a jury that's presided over by a judge. Malcolm claimed self-defense, that there had been neither a conspiracy nor a premeditated shooting. Rather, he showed up unannounced with a concealed weapon loaded with hollow-point bullets he purchased for the express purpose of murdering the mother of his child, brought his wife in for backup, screamed wildly about hitmen, and then acted in self-defense during the heat of passion. Malcolm claimed Chelsea, unarmed and holding an infant moments before, was the aggressor. Unsurprisingly, Malcolm's court-martial panel didn't buy his self-defense claim either. At court-martial, Malcolm Turner was convicted of 1 specification of attempted killing with premeditation, 1 specification of conspiracy to commit premeditated murder, 1 specification of obstruction of justice for disposing of the firearm, and 1 specification of maiming. Malcolm was charged but not convicted of reckless endangerment of his son. Prosecutors probably could have also successfully prosecuted him for the adultery, but that rightfully wasn't the focus for his court-martial. Malcolm was sentenced to confinement for life without the possibility of parole, reduction from E4 to E1, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge. He was given 599 days of confinement credit. And this confinement credit feels a little bit ironic because taking 600 days off a life sentence is still a life sentence. At her court-martial, which was after Malcolm's, Annelyntherese Turner was convicted of 1 specification of attempted premeditated murder, 1 specification of conspiring to commit murder, and 1 specification of making a false official statement. She was acquitted of 1 specification of accessory after the fact. Annelyntherese was also sentenced to confinement for life without the possibility of parole, reduction from E5 to E1, and dishonorable discharge. Army, I've got a safety brief for you. Be all you can be, unless all you can be is a family of murderers. Legal Beagles, let's dig into what happened after Malcolm and Annelyntherese were sentenced. As this shooting happened in Clarksville, Tennessee, not on Fort Campbell, both the military and the local state prosecutor had jurisdiction over the offense. This is actually a relatively rare occurrence in the civilian criminal world. When a civilian commits a crime, either the state or the feds have jurisdiction, but usually not both. For military crimes, however, this happens much more frequently because the crimes they commit, the crimes we talk about together on this podcast, are violations of both state and military law. It's called concurrent jurisdiction, and it basically means that both the military and the state have jurisdiction over the criminal act and can both prosecute the service member for the same incident. If there's a part of your brain that's shaking the dust off of high school government classes and civics classes, you may be wondering about double jeopardy. Double jeopardy would prohibit a prosecutor from charging a person for the same thing twice, but under the doctrine of separate sovereignty, double jeopardy does not prohibit the state from prosecuting a service member, even if the military just prosecuted and convicted that same person for the same criminal act. In practice, the local state governments and local military prosecutors typically have what is called a memorandum of understanding, in which they agree that if one convicts a service member, the other agrees not to charge the same service member. After Malcolm and Annelyntherese received sentences of life without the possibility of parole, the Montgomery County District Attorney officially dropped the charges against them in the civilian courts. There's an additional benefit to dropping the charges after they were sentenced. If, for whatever reason, their military convictions were overturned in the future, Malcolm and Annelyntherese could still be tried in Tennessee State Court, as long as the statute of limitations had not yet expired. In Tennessee, crimes punishable by death or life in prison don't have a statute of limitations. On appeal to the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, Malcolm Turner claimed 7 legal errors. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals determined that only 3 of those merited discussion, went on to discuss 4 of them, and determined that 2 warranted relief. Malcolm claimed first that the prosecutor presented conflicting theories of liability between the case against himself and Annelyntherese. Second, that the conviction for obstruction of justice was factually insufficient. Third, that the maiming charge should have been merged into the attempted premeditated killing charge. And finally, the specification for attempted premeditated killing failed to state an offense because it did not explicitly state that the killing was wrong. The 2 most interesting of these arguments discussed by the court were whether the prosecutor improperly charged Malcolm and the obstruction of justice conviction. Back during his court-martial and directly after receiving his guilty verdict, Malcolm suddenly moved to dismiss the maiming specification as an unreasonable multiplication of charges and the attempted premeditated killing specification for failure to state an offense. Trial counsel conceded that they charged Malcolm with maiming in the alternative to the premeditated killing charge, and the government didn't object to a conditional dismissal of the maiming charge and conviction. As a sidebar, I empathize with trial counsel in that court-martial. I can imagine the sense of relief as the verdict was read, only to have this motion made moments later. You may have caught that when describing Malcolm and Annelyntherese's convictions earlier, I mentioned that Malcolm was convicted of attempted killing with premeditation, and Annelyntherese was convicted of attempted premeditated murder. Malcolm argued that because the charge sheet did not state that the attempted killing was wrongful, which is one of the 4 elements of an attempted premeditated murder, it failed to explicitly allege all of the elements of an attempted premeditated murder charge, and that by failing to allege a complete offense, Malcolm's constitutional rights were violated because he did not have notice of the charges against him. The court had to determine whether Malcolm had sufficient notice that he was being charged with the offense of attempted premeditated murder, despite the fact that the charge did not explicitly list the unlawful element and was titled as attempted killing with premeditation. The court concluded that Malcolm had sufficient notice because on several occasions his defense counsel acknowledged that Malcolm was charged with attempted premeditated murder. In a defense motion, they listed attempted murder as one of the charges he faced. At voir dire, the defense counsel started a question with, "One of the offenses alleged in this case is attempted premeditated murder." The instructions given to the jury stated, "The accused is charged with the offense of attempted premeditated murder." In closing statements, defense counsel talked about the government's case, that this was a premeditated murder plot. Finally, the court concluded, the final charge of conspiracy to commit murder, which intrinsically is an unlawful killing, clearly gave notice that this was an attempted unlawful killing. The entire defensive strategy demonstrated that Malcolm Turner had actual notice of the charges levied against him and gave him ample opportunity to respond. And, as a matter of fact, he did respond to them consistently at each stage of his court-martial. Additionally, it would be entirely unreasonable for Malcolm to think he was on trial for a lawful killing, a battlefield killing. The court asserted that U.S. Army soldiers know the difference between using force to kill an enemy combatant and the premeditated murder of your infant's mother over child support. It is, or should be, clear to everyone that a fellow soldier was clearly an unlawful target. Malcolm Turner was thousands of miles away from any battlefield, and there was no doubt about the charge he faced during his trial. Both the Army Court of Criminal Appeals and the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces concluded that the charge gave Malcolm adequate notice and was thus legally sufficient, although poorly written. The obstruction of justice conviction is where things get really interesting, at least to me. This conviction was for Malcolm's disposal of the gun, which was never recovered. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals dismissed the obstruction of justice conviction and found that it was factually insufficient. That is, the appellate court didn't think there was enough evidence introduced at trial that proved Malcolm obstructed justice, i.e. that he disposed of the gun. During Malcolm's court-martial, he alleged that the crime scene investigators were sloppy and missed the gun at the scene. Remember, though, the downstairs neighbors saw Malcolm fleeing with the gun and testified to that in court. From where I sit, which, for context, is a dark walk-in closet in the basement of our house, the gun disappeared sometime in that hour between when the neighbors saw Malcolm and Annelyntherese flee and when they were stopped and their car was searched. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals suggested that the evidence was factually insufficient to convict Malcolm of disposing of the gun because Annelyntherese could have disposed of the gun after Malcolm's arrest, after their conspiracy terminated. I find this to be an illogical conclusion. Was the gun hidden on Annelyntherese's body? Was she reaching into her clothing and tossing a gun into the bushes while the police searched her husband and her car? Although it may be generous to even describe this plot as harebrained, it defies logic to dispose of bloody clothing and to hold on to the literal smoking gun. To me, it seems like the court was reaching in their finding of factual insufficiency. A finding of factual insufficiency that there wasn't enough evidence for a reasonable trier of fact to come to this conclusion completely undercuts the judicial process. In American law, there's this great deference to the trial court on findings of fact. The people that are in the courtroom to hear witnesses, to see evidence up close, to observe mannerisms and interactions, to determine the credibility of witnesses, have an advantage that people reading from a dry trial transcript simply do not. Dismissing the obstruction of justice conviction and merging the maiming conviction meant that suddenly Malcolm was only convicted of 2 crimes instead of 4, and the Army Court of Criminal Appeals had to reassess his sentence. They ultimately found that those 2 convictions were functionally meaningless. The big bad crime was attempted murder. Malcolm Turner wasn't given a life sentence for disposing of a gun. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals was confident the panel would have still given Malcolm at least life without parole if he was only convicted of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The obstruction conviction increased maximum punishment by 5 years of confinement. Both attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder carry an upper limit of life without parole. Or, to put a finer point on it, life without parole minus 5 years is still life without parole. Although I may personally disagree with overturning the obstruction of justice conviction, at least it had no measurable impact on the sentence Malcolm Turner serves. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean the world to me if you subscribed and rated Conduct Unbecoming wherever you listen to podcasts. You're invited to submit case suggestions and other feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time with a slightly lighter look into some high crimes in the high desert. Until then, take care.